I chose this town for its silence. After 3 decades working as an environmental engineer, first in HOA Colorado, canyons, then in the smog-choked valleys of central California, I craved air that didn't taste like worry. I wanted to sit on a porch without hearing machines grinding rock into powder or trucks coughing diesel into the sky. So when I retired 5 years ago, I bought a modest ranch-style house on the very edge of Alder Ridge, a town so small that strangers still wave at you from their porch swings. The back of my property touched what locals called the Wild Band, an undeveloped stretch of land between the last row of HOA manicured houses and the scrub hills beyond. It wasn't federal land, nor was it officially protected. But to me, it was sacred. Wild sage dry grass and a scattering of granite outcrops dotted the land like a forgotten canvas. I spent hours walking that ridge, notebook in hand, tracking seasonal plant life, soil shifts, and water flow just out of habit. It was second nature, like breathing. My neighbors were pleasant enough, though the HOA had a tight grip on everything from mailbox paint to lawn gnomes. I didn't mind. Rules keep people civil, I used to think. And besides, my property was technically outside their direct jurisdiction. They left me alone as long as I paid the annual buffer fee for road maintenance and community impact. The president of the HOA, Martha Elridge, had once introduced herself with a toothy smile and a red vest stitched with the HOA emblem and embossed pine tree on top of a gold triangle. She told me she was a visionary for suburban harmony. I took it as HOA speak for someone who liked things tidy and predictable. We didn't speak often after that. I didn't like the way her eyes scanned my solar panels like she was cataloging something inconvenient. Most mornings, I sat on my porch with a mug of black coffee and watched the sunrise over the hills. I'd never imagined myself as a small-town retiree, but I liked how the silence here felt earned. It had weight. It had dignity. Then about 9 weeks ago, something changed. It started with a faint tremor under my boots while I was weeding the back fence, a low rhythmic hum too steady to be natural. I thought maybe someone was repaving a driveway or putting in a pool, things the HOA usually celebrated in their monthly flyers. But the sound didn't stop. In fact, it returned every other morning, slightly louder, slightly closer. The air had a new smell, chalky metallic, almost like construction dust. I asked my neighbor, Len, a retired high school teacher who walked his dog past my fence every morning. He frowned. Some folks say they're fixing trails, he said. Others say it's just a landscaping project. For whom I asked, he just shrugged. You know how Martha is. Always got project. I let it go at first. I figured it wasn't my business until I saw the trucks. 2 weeks after the vibrations began, a line of heavy-duty vehicles started parking along the service road behind the ridge. Not pickup trucks or landscaping vans, these were larger. Haulers, water tenders, equipment with ventilation cages and giant tires caked in clay. My stomach dropped. I'd seen equipment like that before at quarry sites. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked out back with a flashlight and aimed it toward the ridge. I couldn't see much, just shadows and the outlines of machinery, but I heard it rock, grinding the echo of metal claws pulling at earth and the faint hiss of dust being carried east by the breeze. The next morning, everything looked the same, yet different. My rosebush leaves had a strange gray tinge. My porch railing felt sticky, coated in a fine grit. Even my dog, Jasper, kept sneezing when he sniffed the air. I opened my old field case, unchanged since my days with the Department of Environmental Resources, and pulled out my portable air quality monitor. I powered it up, calibrated it for particulate matter under 2.5 microns, and held it aloft. The number that blinked back at me was no joke, 67 micrograms per cubic meter. I blinked twice. That was more than double the safe exposure level for a 4-hour period. I ran the test again in my living room with the windows shut. Still elevated. The dust wasn't just outside anymore. It was in our lungs, our curtains, our kids' bedrooms. The HOA newsletter arrived that same day. A glossy 2-page spread titled, Bringing Nature to the Ridge. There were stock photos of families, hiking, smiling teens, planting shrubs, a few inspirational quotes about reconnecting with the earth. Not a single mention of rock extraction. Not a word about drilling. I sent an email to the HOA asking directly, is there any construction or excavation happening on HOA-managed land near the ridge? Air quality concerns are rising. Please advise. I received a brief reply. Dear Mr. Kane, thank you for your concern. The board assures you that all current landscaping activity complies with municipal codes. No further details are necessary at this time. Sincerely, Martha Elridge. Landscaping. I closed the laptop and stared out the window. There were no landscapers out there, only machines that chewed through stone, and an association that thought I was too old, too retired, and too far on the edge of town to care. But they were wrong, because I knew something they didn't. I knew how to read wind patterns. I knew how microdust behaved in arid environments. I knew the law. And most importantly, I knew how to fight back without them even realizing the war had started. It was just past dawn when the first real rumble hit. I was sipping my coffee and reading an old environmental impact study from the 1990s. Something I'd kept for nostalgia more than relevance, when the floorboards beneath me vibrated. Not a sharp jolt like an earthquake, but a long rolling shudder that lasted several seconds. Jasper stood up from his rug and barked toward the back door. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of vibration that doesn't come from household appliances or nearby cars. This was industrial, purposeful, and it was getting bolder. I walked outside in my slippers and robe, following the pulse beneath my feet, to the edge of the ridge. The morning sun had barely cleared the hills, but I could see more clearly now, giant clawed excavators, backhoes, and dump trucks creeping across the horizon like metallic insects. Their engines snarled like beasts. A white dust plume already hung above them, drifting lazily towards a town. My first instinct was disbelief. That couldn't be an HOA-sanctioned project. Not in a residential zone. Not that close to private homes. But then again, I'd seen stranger things slip through, under the guise of community enhancement, over the years. I grabbed my phone and took photos, close-ups, panoramas, time-stamped and geotagged. Then I stood still, trying to listen, trying to understand what they were doing. The sound was grinding, relentless, interspersed with sharp clangs like rock on steel. Explosives hadn't been used yet, but I knew they would be. That's the rhythm of stone mining, strip, break, haul, crush, repeat. A neighbor named Meredith waved at me from across the street later that morning. She looked uneasy. Have you heard the noise? She asked. Yes, I said. You started 2 weeks ago. My windows shake when I set dishes out to dry. She looked down at her feet, like she wasn't sure if she should say more. Did you get the flyer? What flyer? She glanced toward her house. They left one in our mail slot yesterday. It said it's a natural rock harvesting pilot program to create a new amphitheater for community events. Phase 1 is earth assessment and material gathering. Material gathering, I echoed. That's just a sanitized term for mining. I thought you'd say that. She handed me a crumpled copy of the flyer. It was printed in glossy color with large, friendly fonts. Pictures of smiling families sitting on tiered stone seating with phrases like, sustainable, local, beautiful. It looked like an ad for a spa, not a heavy equipment site. At the bottom, in small print, approved by the Alder Ridge HOA Development Committee, February 14th. No mention of public meetings. No city permits listed. No environmental review codes. No dust mitigation plans. I thanked Meredith and took the flyer inside. By noon, a fine white coat had settled on my kitchen windowsills, despite everything being closed. The dust was everywhere, gritty between my teeth, clinging to my clothes, dulling the once vivid green of my backyard vines. That afternoon, I made 3 calls. First to City Hall. The clerk there, a young man named Diego, told me there was no registered commercial excavation permit issued for that part of Alder Ridge. Second, to the county recorder's office. They confirmed no deed transfer or usage change had been filed. Third, to the HOA's public liaison, a woman named Janice. I'd met once at a barbecue. She sounded cheerful at first. Oh yes, the amphitheater, it's going to be lovely. So much community excitement. I asked her where this dust was going to go. I'm sorry. The dust, I said evenly. From the aggregate crushing and hauling. You've already started moving limestone. That's a PM10 hazard, and the prevailing winds carry directly over the residential sector. There was a pause. I'm not authorized to speak on that, she said carefully. I replied. 32 years in air quality compliance and site evaluation. She hung up. The next day, 3 trucks loaded with crushed rock rumbled down Oak Terrace Drive, leaving a chalky trail in their wake. I followed them on foot, snapping more photos. One driver honked at me, flipping a middle finger through the side mirror. It didn't faze me. I'd been flipped off by worse people, senators, CEOs, a governor once. I was halfway back to my house when I passed a group of children playing hopscotch on a driveway. One of the girls had a red rash around her mouth. Another boy was coughing dry and persistent. Their mother stood nearby, arms crossed, looking toward the ridge with that same unsettled expression Meredith had worn. "You should move your kids indoors," I said gently. "This isn't safe." "They said it's temporary," she murmured. "They said it's organic dust." I clenched my jaw. There's no such thing as organic dust in limestone mining. And any association that described it that way was either ignorant or lying, or both. I spent the next few hours on my laptop reviewing all EPA thresholds, pulling up satellite data wind vectors, and historical weather patterns. I created overlays and plotted probable dust dispersion over the next 14 days based on current activity. My old skills clicked back into gear like they'd never left. At 5:00 p.m., I walked out to the backyard with my particle sensor and began logging numbers. PM 10, 104 Yugum 3, PM 25, Selajuan 3, both well beyond the recommended exposure limits. The evening air shimmered with grit visible in the golden light. I didn't need more proof. I had the data, I had the patterns, and I knew what this would become: children wheezing, gardens dying, long-term lung complications, and lawsuits. But most of all, I knew what this kind of operation looked like when it collapsed, because I'd written those reports. I'd been the guy regulators called when towns like mine didn't catch on until it was too late. This time I was already watching, and I wasn't going to wait until someone ended up in the ER. The next morning, I opened my eyes before the alarm even had a chance to buzz. My body knew what was coming. I didn't bother with coffee. I went straight to the back porch with my air monitor and my old Nikon camera. The sky was already hazy, like a foggy film had settled over the ridge overnight. But it wasn't fog. It was dust. Pale and almost shimmering in the early sunlight, carried on a warm, dry wind that blew downhill right into Alder Ridge. I turned on the sensor. PM 2591 Algem 3. Unhealthy. Dangerous. And it wasn't even 7 a.m. I could taste it on my tongue. Gritty bitter, like licking concrete. My nose burned. Jasper coughed once, then twice. I looked down at him. His eyes were watery. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. This was a health crisis in the making. By 8 a.m., I had received 2 texts and a voicemail from neighbors. The voicemail was from a woman named Angela, a single mother of 2 who lived closer to the ridge. Her voice cracked as she said, "Mr. Kane, I know you know more about this stuff than the rest of us. My son woke up with a nosebleed. He's 8. We didn't even open the windows last night." I sat down, opened my laptop, and started writing an open letter to the HOA. I titled it, "Unacceptable Levels, a Call for Immediate Suspension of Mining Activities Near Alder Ridge." I included, and my credentials in air quality and site remediation, the daily particulate matter readings from 3 days in a row, photographs showing the haze over the neighborhood, annotated satellite images, anecdotal evidence from multiple residents. I didn't accuse anyone. Not directly. I knew better than that. But I framed it like a public safety concern, exactly the kind of language the HOA usually weaponized in their monthly citations for unsightly mailboxes or invasive flower species. I used their tone against them: concern order, liability. By 11 a.m., I'd sent it to every member of the board. I posted a version on Nextdoor, I shared it on the town's community Facebook page. I emailed it to the County Environmental Health Department and carbon copied 2 people I knew at the regional EPA office in Stockton. I kept it professional. I kept it airtight. By noon, the replies had started. The HOA's first response was a PDF, a glossy, soulless statement that read like it had been written by a PR firm. "We are aware of minor air quality fluctuations and are monitoring the situation. Our landscaping and beautification efforts near the ridge are being carried out in accordance with all relevant community guidelines and safety protocols. Please refrain from spreading misinformation that may cause unnecessary alarm." Misinformation. They dared to use that word. I replied directly to Martha Elridge, attaching 4 more particulate readings, a thermal map, and a simple note. You are now in documented receipt of environmental hazard data. If adverse health effects escalate and no corrective action is taken, your liability will be traceable and recorded. I didn't hear back, but at 3:17 p.m., the trucks stopped running. For a moment, I thought they might have paused the project, but then a new sound rolled in. Louder, thicker, closer. I followed it to the front yard and saw two enormous tankers marked "Wash Out Water" backing up toward the ridge. They were trying to use reclaimed wastewater to spray down the dust, a classic industry tactic. It was laughably ineffective. The next morning, the air was worse. The whole town looked like it had been rolled in flour. Sidewalks coated in pale silt. Cars streaked with white residue. And still the HOA insisted there was nothing wrong. That afternoon, Angela stopped by with her son, Ethan. He clung to her leg listless. His face looked drawn and his breathing was shallow. I knelt down next to him. "Hey buddy, you feeling okay?" He nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. Angela bit her lip. "We just came from urgent care. The doctor said it might be asthma triggered by particulate matter." He gave us an inhaler, but she lowered her voice. He asked if we lived near an industrial site. I looked her in the eyes. "You do." Her shoulders sagged. "I'm scared," she whispered. "For him, for us." I put a hand on her shoulder. "Don't be, not yet." That night, I climbed the ridge. I knew the patrols only lasted until dusk, and I needed to get closer. The equipment was still running just slower, maybe because the operators were trying to avoid detection. I crouched in a patch of sage and watched them work. They weren't just gathering rock for some amphitheater. They were cutting deep. Layers of stratified stone were being ripped from the earth, loaded into trucks that disappeared behind portable barriers and thick green mesh tarps. But I could still see, and I could still hear. The sound of damage is very specific. It's not just noise. It's rhythm. It's method. And I knew what it meant. This was not phase 1 of beautification. This was full-scale mineral extraction. And it was being done under the nose of every family that trusted this HOA to protect their neighborhood. I pulled out my field recorder and documented the activity. Machinery IDs, frequencies, even truck plate numbers. I recorded a video with timestamp overlay. I made sure I had everything. When I got back home, I uploaded it to a drive, backed it up twice, labeled the folder, Evidence Ridge Mining. Then I opened a new email to someone I hadn't contacted in years, Michael Goddard. He'd been my supervisor at the West California EPA for over a decade. Retired now like me, but I knew Michael. He didn't like to sit still. He worked on advisory panels. He had pull. My message was simple. "Michael, I believe a neighborhood HOA has greenlit unpermitted mining near Alder Ridge under the pretense of landscape development. PM 2.5 levels are beyond federal safety guidelines. Kids are getting sick. I have evidence. Need your eyes on this." I clicked send. Outside, the wind shifted again, and the dust returned. But now I had sent something just as invisible and far more dangerous back into their world. Michael responded within 12 hours. His email was brief but direct. "You always had a nose for the worst messes. Send me everything. I'll make a call, quietly." I didn't need more than that. I compiled the footage, photo, sensor data, and annotated maps into a single compressed archive and sent it off with a secure link. By the time I closed my laptop, the sky outside was the color of old chalk. The sun, dimmed by particulate haze, looked like a tired coin trying to push through. I knew how the next steps would go. Michael would hand the data to a field inspector. They'd log it into the federal complaint database, maybe request clarification from local authorities. But he'd also call someone off the record, a favor here, a nudge there, and things would move faster. Because this wasn't just about dust anymore. This was about people being lied to. By that evening, I started to notice subtle changes in HOA behavior. The weekly newsletter, usually stuffed into our mailboxes on Wednesdays, never came. The HOA website, typically updated with perky community spotlights and Martha Elridge's red-vested grins, was suddenly offline for maintenance. Even the pickup schedule for lawn debris was postponed due to staffing realignment. It smelled like fear, and it was about time. That night, I drove out to the edge of the ridge and parked behind an old oak tree that had survived a dozen droughts. I didn't get out. I just watched. One by one, trucks began to line up again, but this time, they were marked with a new logo I hadn't seen before. Granex Inc. It rang a bell. I dug into the state contractor database as soon as I got home. Granex was a privately owned quarry and raw aggregate company based out of eastern Nevada. Their permits for operating in California were limited and definitely not inclusive of Alder Ridge. But more importantly, I found a recent filing, a subcontractor agreement between Granex Inc. and AR Redevelopment Initiative LLC. My stomach dropped. AR as in Alder Ridge. They'd created a shell company. I cross-referenced the filing address. It was a P.O. box downtown. But the name attached to the registration was less ambiguous. Vice President Martha Elridge. Charles. So there it was. Martha, the self-proclaimed visionary for suburban harmony, had signed off on a private mining operation under the cover of a beautification project and funneled it through a corporate entity, likely owned or at least heavily influenced by the board. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of the dust or the noise, but because I couldn't believe I'd let it get this far. I'd trusted the HOA to be overbearing but benign. I'd assumed their worst sins were decorative bans and petty fines. This was industrial-scale deception. The next day, I walked to Meredith's house. She answered the door with her inhaler already in hand. "Did you find something?" she asked immediately. I nodded. "They're not just reshaping the land, they're mining it, illegally, and profiting." Her eyes widened. Martha's at the center of it. She didn't speak, her jaw tensed. I showed her the documents, the permits, the subcontractor agreement. Her hands trembled as she held the printouts. "They've been spraying water on the kids' park every morning," she whispered, "to keep it clean." "But it's just recycled runoff from the hill, isn't it? Likely contaminated." She covered her mouth. "My daughter plays there every day." We went door to door after that, quietly, methodically talking to neighbors we knew would listen. Not everyone believed us. Some shrugged and said it's just dust, or I'm sure they know what they're doing. But others, especially those with children, pets, or aging parents, listened carefully. And then we reached Angela again. She didn't need convincing. Her son's breathing had worsened. She showed me the nebulizer, the ER bills, the letter from their landlord suggesting that continued health complaints could be considered a lease violation. "They want to evict us," she said through tears, "because I've been causing trouble." I asked her if she'd be willing to go on record off the books for an environmental statement. She looked at her son, then back at me. "Yes," she said, "whatever it takes." That night, I wrote a full brief to Michael. I included the signed statements from Angela Meredith and a few others. I didn't ask for promises. I asked for action. By Friday, I got it. A team of inspectors from Region 9 was being dispatched. No official press release, no warning. Just boots on the ground. Quiet. Federal. Real. I smiled for the first time in weeks. But the HOA must have felt the shift in the air too, because the next day I received a letter on official HOA letterhead, delivered not by mail but slipped under my door. Notice of non-compliance and disruptive activity. Mr. Kane, it has come to our attention that your actions have caused undue alarm and disturbance within the Alder Ridge community. Spreading unfounded claims and interfering with community improvement efforts are grounds for fines and removal from shared resource privileges. Cease all slanderous communication regarding HOA initiatives immediately. Failure to comply may result in legal consequences. No signature, just the seal of the HOA. They were scared. Good. I posted the letter online. Within an hour, 50 comments. By evening, 200 shares. People were waking up, and for once, it wasn't the dust making it hard to breathe. It was the weight of betrayal. By Monday morning, there was no more pretending. I woke up to find a pale crust of dust coating the inside of my windows like fine ash after a fire. It clung to everything, frames, curtains, the inside rim of my coffee mug I'd forgotten by the sink. Jasper sneezed as he pawed at the glass door. Outside, visibility was down to a quarter mile. You couldn't see the next street over. It looked like the town had been swallowed by a slow-moving storm. But there were no clouds, no rain, no wind, only dust. I dressed and walked 2 blocks down to the elementary school. Not to protest, just to see. I wasn't the only one. A small crowd had gathered at the front, concerned parents confused, grandparents, teachers coughing behind their masks. One mother I recognized, Elise, was visibly shaking. My daughter came home Friday with blood in her tissue, she said. They said it's probably allergies, but she's never had allergies. Another man, gray-haired and stone-faced, simply pointed to the parking lot. Every car had a fine white film thick enough to write names in with your finger. I stood there quietly watching. Then I noticed the kids. Inside the cafeteria, through the large windows, dozens of them sat at folding tables. Some were eating. Some were rubbing their eyes. A few had masks, others didn't. And one boy, tall, skinny, maybe 10 years old, had his head on the table, curled into his elbow like he was trying to disappear. I turned and walked home. By the time I got back, there were 2 envelopes taped to my front door. The first was another notice of violation from the HOA. They now claimed I had unauthorized solar panel reflectivity, disrupting neighborhood aesthetics. Laughable. The second was worse. A cease and desist letter from a law firm in Sacramento representing AR Redevelopment Initiative LLC, the same shell company Martha had created to contract Grainer. The letter accused me of defamation interference with private development and unauthorized monitoring of an active project site. They demanded I retract my public statements and delete all online posts, or else face civil penalties. I sat on my porch, holding the papers, and for a moment, I felt the familiar tremor of dread in my chest, an echo of old battles I'd fought with corporations far nastier than this. I knew how these games worked. First came the warnings, then the isolation, then the legal sludge meant to drown you in paperwork until you broke or walked away. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore, because they'd made a mistake. They came for my neighbors. They came for the kids. And now the town was watching. At 2:00 p.m., the regional EPA inspection team arrived. 3 white SUVs rolled up to the Ridge access gate. They wore windbreakers with small official patches and carried equipment cases like I used to. No announcements, no press, just professionals. Within minutes, they were walking the edge of the quarry with sensors, drones, and soil test kits. They waved off the on-site security, 2 overweight men in polos who didn't know what to do when their authority meant nothing. I stood behind the fence a good 50 yards away, just watching. Then, one of the inspectors turned around, spotted me, and gave the faintest nod. That was all I needed. The next morning, a letter from the EPA was circulated to the town's municipal inbox. An environmental assessment underway. Residents advised to limit outdoor exposure. Investigation into particulate emissions in progress. Within 2 hours, panic swept through the HOA. They sent a town-wide email. In light of unforeseen regulatory review, we are temporarily pausing landscape work to better coordinate with public agencies. We assure our valued community members that all efforts were intended to enhance our shared space. It was pathetic, and it was too late. Meredith texted me a photo of the school courtyard now cordoned off with yellow caution tape. Angela messaged that her son Ethan was being transferred to a pediatric pulmonologist. Elise forwarded a teacher's letter confirming the administration was recommending indoor-only recess until air conditions improve. The damage was done. That evening, I sat with Meredith and 3 other neighbors in my living room. We printed copies of the subcontractor filings, the HOA's charter, the air quality data, and the EPA warning. We built a packet clear, concise, irrefutable. Then we went door to door again. This time, people didn't hesitate. We gathered 143 signatures in 2 days, enough to call for a special vote to suspend the HOA board and appoint an interim oversight committee. Martha didn't respond to emails. Her red vest wasn't seen around the neighborhood anymore. But her name was on every document, and soon it would be on every lawsuit. Still, something gnawed at me. Granex hadn't packed up. The equipment was still there, idle but poised. The trucks still sat near the ridge, lined up like a dormant threat. I had a feeling the HOA wasn't giving up, not yet, because for them, this wasn't just about rocks or money. It was about control, and control once taken for granted never dies quietly. That night, I got a phone call. A voice I didn't recognize said, "You should stop. You don't know who you're messing with." Then they hung up. I looked out into the dark backyard, the wind whispering through the brittle leaves. I wasn't scared. They could threaten, sue, lie, or hide. But now the town was awake, and I was just getting started. I didn't call the police after that phone call. I'd been around too long to think a single anonymous threat was enough to spark panic or get action. Besides, I had a more effective response in mind. The same day I opened the old chest in my garage that hadn't been touched in years. It still smelled of machine oil and sun-baked plastic. Inside were the tools from my past life: my high-resolution particulate scanner, a portable weather meter, sealed test kits, and the crowning jewel, a calibrated handheld LiDAR unit I'd used on dozens of official site assessments back in my days with the state. I laid them out on my workbench like old friends come home to help. The neighborhood might have thought of me as the quiet old man at the edge of town. But what they didn't know, what the HOA had failed to consider, was that I had spent 3 decades on the front lines of environmental warfare. I'd shut down refineries. I'd stood face to face with corporate lawyers in marble-tiled offices. I'd testified in courtrooms where air turned into politics. I wasn't some angry retiree. I was trained for this. That night, I returned to the ridge not just with my camera, but with the full array of sensors. The winds had picked up slightly, and I knew from the weather forecast that this would be a dispersal night when particulate matter would travel fastest across low terrain. Perfect conditions to measure true airborne pollution. I set up 3 tripods along different elevations, one behind my own property, one near the school fence, and one just outside the east ridge boundary where HOA authority thinned. I calibrated each unit, carefully activating their internal clocks and syncing the data to my laptop via remote link. It took me nearly 4 hours, but by sunrise I had my proof. Readings showed PM 2.5 levels exceeding 135.3 during excavation hours. That was nearly triple the federal health threshold. Worse, the wind models, combined with LiDAR topography, proved that the dust was not only reaching the town, but concentrating in low-lying areas. Parks, schoolyards, playgrounds. They weren't just careless. They were poisoning us systematically. At 9 a.m., I called Michael again. He answered on the second ring. What do you have now? Full dispersal data, coordinated with terrain overlays. You ran field LiDAR. Yes. Want a copy? Send it now. I didn't ask what he was going to do with it. At noon, I got a reply. You're going to want to be home tomorrow at 10 a.m. You might see something interesting. I smiled. That afternoon, I walked the neighborhood again. Not with flyers this time, but with answers. Meredith, now wearing a cloth mask over her nose, let me use her dining room to meet with a handful of parents. Angela came to Ethan holding her hand, a spacer inhaler slung around his neck like a charm. I filed a notice of claim, Angela said. They want to scare us, fine. Let's show them what it means when you hurt someone's child. Others nodded. We've started a fund, Meredith added. People are donating online. For medical costs, legal fees, and if we get enough testing for everyone. Count me in, I said. We'll need it. That evening, I stood on my back porch again. Dust danced under the porch light, the air thick as paper. I could hear the low hum of trucks idling on the other side of the ridge. The HOA hadn't stopped. They were just waiting for this to blow over. But the wind was against them now. At 9:58 a.m. the next day, a convoy of 4 unmarked vehicles and 2 EPA vans rolled into Alder Ridge. Federal officers and windbreakers emerged with clipboards, test kits, and sealed warrants. They headed straight for the Ridge access gate. By 10:12 a.m., the gate was cut open with bolt cutters. Martha Elridge showed up at 10:19, face flushed, red vest barely zipped. She marched toward the officers, waving her clipboard. You can't be here without HOA permission, she shouted. One of the agents calmly showed her the warrant. She froze, lips parted. Then her eyes scanned the crowd that had gathered, dozens of residents lining the sidewalks, phones raised, recording. I stepped forward. This isn't your ridge anymore, I said. Her eyes locked onto mine. Something behind them, authority, confidence, entitlement, cracked. The inspection team moved quickly. Air samples, soil cores, stormwater basin readings. They brought in a drone with a live sensor array and flew it above the pit where the excavation had been taking place. Within minutes, they found unmarked barrels, partially buried chemical dust suppressants, the kind that required disclosure and permitting. It was a violation, a big one. One of the officers spoke quietly into his radio. Moments later, a separate team of EPA agents arrived with cameras and enforcement jackets. Granex employees were asked to cease all activity and remain on site. One man tried to leave. He was stopped. By noon, the entire operation was locked down. Martha refused to answer questions. She walked back to her car in silence, trailed by whispers. The crowd didn't cheer. They just stood there stunned, watching decades of blind trust collapse in real time. That evening, the local news ran the story. EPA launches federal investigation into unpermitted mining in Alder Ridge. Children sickened by dust, residents outraged at HOA secrecy. My name wasn't mentioned. I didn't need it to be. The work wasn't about ego. It was about the boy with the inhaler, the mother who couldn't sleep, the old man who couldn't open his window without coughing, and the land, the ridge that had been here long before the HOA existed, finally breathing again. But I knew this wasn't over. The federal gears had begun to turn, but the local fight was just heating up. 3 days after the EPA shut down the ridge site, I received a certified letter at my front door. Not from the HOA this time, but from a law office representing GranX Inc. The envelope was heavy. Inside 16 pages of legal threats, accusations, and demands. They claimed I had trespassed on private commercial operations, damaged future profit expectancy, and intentionally interfered with contracted municipal development. They wanted me to cease all contact with media, destroy my environmental data, and issue a written apology, or they'd seek damages in excess of $850,000. They ended it with a chilling line. You are advised to consider your exposure and liability should this matter proceed to civil court. I set the letter down on my kitchen counter and laughed. Not because it wasn't serious, it was, but because it was desperate. GranX wasn't trying to win. They were trying to scare me into silence. They were used to towns rolling over. But I wasn't from one of those towns. I was from the Ridge. The next morning, I brought the letter to Angela and Meredith, who were now serving as the de facto leaders of the newly formed Alder Ridge Neighborhood Alliance, a watchdog group created after the scandal broke. We met in the old church basement with folding chairs, a coffee urn that burned everything, and a whiteboard covered in plans. Angela read the letter with quiet fury. "They're trying to crush you," she said. "Just like they tried to shame me into silence when Ethan got sick." Meredith looked over her glasses. "Do you want to make this public?" I nodded. "Not yet, but we need to be ready." Angela slid a manila folder across the table. "I think it's time we show you this." Inside was a copy of the original HOA charter, the legal framework for Alder Ridge's governing association filed with the county 22 years ago. On page 17 in tiny print was a clause. Any project designated as community enrichment may bypass resident voting requirements if approved by a 2/3 board majority. The loophole. They'd used that language, community enrichment, to bypass any need for a public vote, legal review, or environmental impact statement. No one had read this clause because for 20 years, the HOA used it for things like holiday festivals and gazebo repairs. But Martha had exploited it to build a quarry. Meredith sighed. "We believe it was added at the last minute." She was on the drafting committee in 2003. I leaned back. She had planned this for decades. It wasn't just about dust or greed. It was legacy. She wanted her name on something permanent. She thought the amphitheater would be her crowning achievement. A legacy project that could be justified, defended, even praised. Until it poisoned children. Until it got caught. And now she would burn anyone who tried to stop her. That afternoon, I contacted a nonprofit legal team. I used to consult with the West California Environmental Justice League. They had worked with indigenous communities, rural towns near fracking zones, and even former EPA whistleblowers. I forwarded them the GranX letter, the environmental data, and the HOA charter. By evening, they'd responded. "You are within your rights. Their case has no standing. If they proceed, we'll represent you pro bono." I exhaled for the first time in days. Now it was time to go public. The following morning, I wrote a full statement. Not a rant, not a conspiracy blog. A professional, evidence-based account of everything that had happened, start to finish. I included a timeline of the dust complaints, photos of affected children, screenshots of the HOA's lies, proof of the GranX contract and shell company, the cease and desist letter threatening me. I titled it, "This is what happens when you let power dig too deep." I published it on my personal website and shared it with 3 media contacts I'd worked with during my state career. One of them, Danielle Tsai, an investigative reporter in West San Francisco, called me within an hour. "I want to come out," she said. "Talk to the families, walk the site." She arrived the next day with a cameraman and a notebook filled with questions. She interviewed Angela and Ethan, Meredith, Elise, and her daughter. Even Len, the retired teacher, who'd been skeptical at first, now furious, after learning the HOA had put his cancer-stricken wife at risk. Danielle's segment aired 2 days later on regional news. It led the hour. Her voice clear and firm. A suburban HOA cloaked in good intentions allegedly signed off on a commercial mining operation that sickened children, polluted homes, and silenced critics through legal intimidation. But one retired environmental engineer refused to stay silent. The footage showed the ridge from above barren, scarred, still, and lifeless. Then it cut to Ethan using his inhaler in a sunlit kitchen. Then to me standing on my back porch saying softly, "The land always tells the truth. People just have to listen." The town exploded. The story went viral. That weekend, more than 400 people showed up to a community town hall packed shoulder to shoulder in the high school gym. Even those who once defended the HOA now demanded resignations. The red-vested board members didn't show. But we did. Angela stood on stage and read from the medical reports. Meredith read from the charter. I read the final particulate readings aloud, holding up a vial of gray dust collected from a child's bedroom windowsill. This, I said, is what they told us to ignore. The gym was silent. Then someone stood and shouted, "Recall them!" Then another, "Sue them all!" Then applause rolling, rising like a tidal wave, crashing down on a wall that had been cracking for years. That night, the HOA board received official notice of a vote to dissolve their authority pending legal review. It was over, at least for them. But we hadn't healed. Not yet. The morning began quiet. No grinding machines, no trucks, no warnings. Just wind. It moved through Alder Ridge, like it used to, soft, dry, warm with a hint of pine and summer grass. For the first time in weeks, I opened my back door and didn't smell concrete in the air. But I knew the peace wouldn't last long. It never does when people like Martha Elridge feel their grip slipping. The day before, the HOA had filed an emergency injunction to halt the vote to dissolve the board, citing procedural irregularities. Their lawyer used the phrase, "coordinated panic campaign by a disgruntled resident." That disgruntled resident was me. By 9:00 a.m., cars lined the curb in front of the Yaus Community Center, where the new interim oversight committee, formed by residents just 2 days earlier, was gathering for its first meeting. We'd invited the town council, the school superintendent, local press, and most importantly, the inspectors. They came in dark suits and calm expressions, 3 men and 2 women from the EPA and the HOA State's Department of Public Health. They didn't carry cameras or speak loudly. They just arrived, nodded politely, and got to work. We laid out our packets on folding tables, air quality reports, satellite overlays, environmental readings, medical affidavits, legal filings, photos of children's inhalers, letters from physicians, and even testimonial videos. One by one, we presented it, measured, precise, undeniable. Then the inspectors asked their questions. How long was the excavation active? When did symptoms begin among children? What was the HOA's stated purpose for the project? Did they ever present this to the town for review? The answers were clear. 2 months of illegal operations, dozens of health complaints, 0 permits, no disclosure, and behind it all, a hidden for-profit contract designed to mine profit and disappear before anyone noticed. Except we did notice, and we weren't going away. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up with a folder in one hand and the cease and desist letter in the other. My name is Watt Samuel Kane. I worked as an environmental field engineer and compliance specialist for 32 years. I've been retired for 5. But I still know a land grab when I see one. And this, I lifted the letter, is how they tried to silence me. I laid it down next to the photos of Ethan, Angela's son, with his breathing tube and tight, frightened face. You don't need to take my word for it. The land speaks for itself. The room was silent. One of the inspectors nodded slowly. We'll be filing a formal report within 10 business days, he said. But off the record, Mr. Kane, thank you. You've saved lives. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. By noon, word spread that the inspectors had found multiple violations during their physical survey: improper dust containment, failure to register commercial activity, chemical storage on residential soil, absence of air mitigation protocols. They even found non-reported underground fuel tanks, which triggered a hazardous material response unit. Fire crews arrived in silence, dressed in yellow gear, setting up a perimeter. Parents wept, not from fear but from relief, because the lie had finally collapsed. But Martha, she didn't weep. She appeared at 1:42 p.m., flanked by a thin man in a navy suit and two HOA board members who looked like they hadn't slept. She stormed toward the temporary EPA tent, gesturing wildly, waving papers. The inspectors didn't flinch. The state representative calmly pointed toward a printed notice posted on the perimeter fence. This site is under investigation for environmental mismanagement and unauthorized industrial activity. Do not enter. Martha's voice cracked as she shouted, "This was meant to bring value to the community." I followed the charter. I stepped forward. "No, Martha, you rewrote the charter." Her face went white. "You don't understand the legacy I was building," she hissed. I did, actually. I understood it better than she ever would. It was the kind of legacy built on silence, on fear, on burying the truth beneath concrete, and calling it progress. The kind that leaves sick kids and poisoned soil in its wake, but hides behind flower beds and community values. She turned to walk away, but paused. "You've ruined everything," she whispered. "No," I said. "You did that the day you chose to lie." And she left. That night, Danielle Tsai aired her follow-up segment. The footage showed inspectors walking the site in protective gear, followed by a slow pan across the school playground with its empty swings and faded dust masks hanging from the fence like forgotten flags. Danielle's closing line was simple. In Alder Ridge, it wasn't the dust that made people sick, it was the silence around it. And one man refused to stay silent. The next morning, the town voted. By a 91% majority, the HOA board was formally dissolved. Legal oversight was handed to an interim citizen committee supported by the city council. Martha Elridge resigned under public pressure within the week. Her red vest was never seen again. Granex withdrew from the site. EPA teams began remediation, and Alder Ridge slowly, cautiously started to breathe again. But that ridge, that scarred hill behind my house, it still stood there, raw, quiet, waiting. So I planted something. A seed. Not a metaphorical one, a real one. I walked to the most damaged edge of the quarry, knelt down and placed a tiny oak sapling into the earth. It wasn't much, but it would grow. And one day, long after I was gone, it would cast shade over the spot where a lie once began. And perhaps a child would sit under it, never knowing what had been done there, only what had been made right. The ridge was quiet, but the town was not. In the weeks that followed the EPA shutdown and Martha's public humiliation, Alder Ridge transformed. Like something had been unshackled. It wasn't just the trucks and excavators that vanished. It was the unspoken fear that had gripped our community for years. The fear of speaking up. The fear of retaliation over a weed too tall, a paint color too bold, a voice too loud. That fear had cracked. And from that crack, something else grew: anger. Not rage for its own sake, but righteous anger. The kind that compels people to organize, to show up, to hold clipboards, and take notes and ask the kinds of questions the HOA used to shrug off. What was once a sleepy suburb with manicured lawns and polite forced nods had become a neighborhood buzzing with energy. Alder Ridge had awakened, and the red vests were falling apart. It began with quiet resignations. First, Todd Galen, the HOA treasurer, citing family obligations. Then, Maria Peng, the so-called community beautification officer, vanished without a word, no emails, no goodbye, just gone. And when residents requested copies of the HOA's financials over the past 6 months, the silence turned to panic. Nearly $275,000 had been siphoned into something called AR, Civic Improvement Allocations, with no receipts, no invoices, no documented contracts. It was a laundering funnel likely feeding into Granex and back into personal coffers. The interim committee brought in an independent auditor. His report was devastating. Systemic misuse of HOA funds for undisclosed third-party agreements, breach of fiduciary duty, fraud indicators consistent with criminal referral. The report was made public. Martha tried to deny everything in a 3-paragraph statement posted to a private Facebook group. She claimed the funds were earmarked for legacy projects and that the community had misunderstood her vision. Nobody believed her. She was served with a subpoena a week later. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I knew better. People like Martha rarely go down without trying to drag others with them. But Alder Ridge wasn't hers anymore. One morning I walked by the community clubhouse, the old beige building where all those board meetings used to happen behind locked doors. The red HOA flag had been removed. In its place was a whiteboard easel that read, Community meeting. Tonight, transparency, accountability, rebuilding together. Inside, parents and teachers gathered to discuss safer school crossings. Teenagers passed out homemade flyers for a park cleanup day. Angela had created a mutual aid fund for medical bills tied to dust-related illnesses. Meredith was helping seniors fill out claims paperwork against the dissolved HOA. And me, I was back to walking the ridge with my notebook in hand. But not alone. Now other people joined me. Angela and Ethan. Meredith and her grandson. Sometimes even Len, despite his cane. We'd walk the perimeter, where the quarry had once clawed into the soil, and we'd talk about what came next. Native grasses, a butterfly restoration zone, maybe even a community garden. We weren't looking to erase the past. We wanted to plant something over it that could thrive. One Saturday morning, I found a small box on my front porch. No label, no note. Inside, a child's drawing. It showed a big green hill, a smiling sun, and a stick figure man with a white beard standing next to a tree. There was a speech bubble coming from his mouth. It read, "We're safe now." The bottom corner said, "From Ethan." I sat down on the porch steps and wept. Not out of sadness, not even relief, but something deeper, because I realized then what this had all been about, not just the dust, the lies, or the lawsuits. It was about protecting something precious, something silent, something that couldn't defend itself. The land, the children, the truth. Later that week, I received an invitation to speak at the City Council's annual community forum. Not as an accuser, not as an activist, but as a neighbor. I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't have prepared remarks. When I stepped to the podium, I looked out at a sea of familiar faces, some smiling, some tearful. All changed. I cleared my throat. I moved here for the silence, I said, but I stayed for the voices. Laughter, a soft murmur of agreement. And I want to thank you, not for believing me, but for believing in yourselves. You didn't wait for permission. You stood up when it was hard. You protected one another when it mattered most. I paused, holding up the drawing from Ethan. This is what justice looks like in a neighborhood. Not revenge, not punishment, but healing. They stood and clapped, not because of me, but because we had made it through something together. And none of us would ever be the same. The old guard, the red vests, were gone. In their place, open meetings posted minutes, shared decisions, a community reborn. But for me, the real victory wasn't in the policies or votes. It was in the air. One morning I stepped outside and breathed deeply. No dust, just wind and birdsong. And somewhere down the ridge, a child laughing. That was enough. Autumn came quietly that year. The trees along the main road turned amber and gold. The sky, once murky and sallow from limestone dust, now stretched wide and clean, a rich blue dome over a town that had fought to reclaim the very air it breathed. I woke each morning with a new kind of stillness, not the suffocating quiet of fear, but the peace that follows survival. Jasper would nudge me gently, and we'd step out onto the porch together, both of us exhaling into the cool morning breeze. No more film on the windows, no more coughing fits, no more letters slipped under the door. It had taken everything to get here. The remediation process had begun in earnest. Federal trucks came and went, hauling away the chemical barrels hidden near the ridge and replacing poisoned topsoil with nutrient-rich sediment. State crews had removed the temporary fencing and posted laminated signs warning, "Restoration area, no entry until further notice." But something more important had started too, something the inspectors couldn't measure. People began to gather. One Saturday, the community hosted its first town-wide cleanup event under the new Citizen Council. Over 200 residents showed up, rakes in hand wheelbarrows, ready homemade banners fluttering in the breeze. Teenagers painted benches. Parents collected trash. And someone brought donuts, of course. Angela and Ethan were there. He wore a little vest with a cartoon oak tree and the words "Ridge Ranger" ironed on the back. Meredith led a team pruning the overgrown path that used to border the scarred excavation site. Even Len showed up with his thermos and chair, watching the energy unfold like a man witnessing the impossible. I stood by the new welcome sign at the ridge's base. Community restores what greed tried to strip. It wasn't elegant, but it was true. Later that week, I received a formal letter from the EPA's regional office. Dear Mr. Kane, the department wishes to acknowledge your role in identifying and documenting unauthorized environmental activity in Alder Ridge. Your actions led directly to the cessation of illegal mining, prevention of further public health harm, and successful mobilization of federal enforcement. Enclosed, please find a certificate of civil contribution recognizing your exemplary service to the protection of community health and environmental integrity. There was a certificate inside, glossy with my name in embossed letters. I smiled. I didn't frame it, though. I pinned it on the side of my fridge next to Ethan's drawing, the one with the green hill and the stick figure. That drawing still meant more. Weeks passed. Leaves fell. The red vests never returned. Martha's case had escalated. State prosecutors filed charges of misappropriation of public funds and environmental negligence. Her arraignment made the front page of the local paper just below a happier headline. Ridge declared safe. Replanting begins this spring. I didn't attend the trial. I didn't need to. Justice for me had already taken root in the spaces between buildings and beneath children's feet. By December, Angela had launched a new initiative with our interim counsel. The Ridge Guardians, a resident-led coalition focused on environmental education and neighborhood protection. They held workshops at the library, taught kids how to plant native species, started a compost program. They even asked me to speak at the first town seminar. I almost declined. I was tired. But something in Angela's voice, gentle, certain, convinced me. I stood in the rec center looking out at rows of parents and kids, young couples, retired teachers, teenagers, scrolling their phones but listening. I used to think quiet was the most valuable thing a place could give you, I began. But I was wrong. What matters most, what will always matter most, is not silence, it's voice. I held up a small glass jar of clean Ridge soil. This is what your voice can protect. They clapped. Ethan ran up afterward and hugged me around the waist. He was taller now, breathing easier. As winter settled in, I returned to walking the ridge every morning. The dust was long gone. In its place, seedlings pushed up through the dirt framed by little wooden signs etched with names. Each one bore a story. One said hope. Another said Claire. One simply read justice. And the tallest, planted on the highest part of the ridge, had a hand-carved plaque that said, Ethan's tree. Sometimes I sat near that tree with Jasper and watched the clouds move across the sky. I thought about the months that had passed, the fear, the doubt, the war for truth, in a place where the truth had no voice, until someone gave it one. I didn't think of myself as a hero, just a man who saw something wrong and couldn't walk away, who'd fought dust with data, threats with patience, and silence with a voice that had been quiet too long. I'd come here for peace. I'd found purpose, and in the end, I got both. One morning, a girl from the school walked past me on the ridge trail and waved. Thank you for the air, she said. I didn't say anything back. I just nodded, hand to my chest, and let the wind carry her words into the sky. The sky we fought for. The sky we could finally see.